Hello, my name is Catherine Lund-Grayson. I lead the ICRC's climate policy work. I'll be telling you more today about the research presented in a report that we published in 2020 that's called When Rain Turns to Dust, and you can see it on your screen. As you're all aware, the consequences of climate change are felt everywhere, but its most harmful effects are borne by the world's most vulnerable communities. This includes people entering conflict, who are disproportionately impacted by climate risks. And this is why this matters to us as a humanitarian organization working with people affected by conflict and violence. Over the last years, to guide our efforts to better understand the consequences of converging risks and how to adapt our action, we conducted research in the interior of the Central African Republic, southern Iraq, and northern Mali. In the next few minutes, I'd like to discuss 3 points. First, why are people living in conflict particularly vulnerable to climate risks and environmental degradation? Second, how do they cope and adapt? Lastly, how should we adapt our own humanitarian action? So first, why are countries in conflict particularly vulnerable to climate risks? Some 60% of the 25 countries considered the most vulnerable to climate change and the least ready to adapt by the Ndigain Index are in conflict. That's not because climate change causes conflict, but because societies in conflict have a limited adaptive capacity, as conflicts profoundly disrupt their foundations. Conflicts erode development and social cohesion, they can harm the environment on which people rely to survive, and they exacerbate vulnerabilities. Climate risks only worsen people's situation. Here's a quick illustration of how conflicts can directly harm coping mechanisms. In northern Mali, in the face of a bad season, livestock herders normally travel longer distances with their cattle to find grazing land and water. This becomes impossible when conflict prevents them from moving safely with their animals. Conflict can also limit the capacity of the state and humanitarian actors to provide assistance. We end up in a situation where those who have lost everything often end up moving to cities or heading south to greener areas. We can think of this as layers of vulnerability that compound one another and affect all dimensions of people's lives, from their safety and health to their food, water, and economic security. Along with other megatrends, such as demographic growth or urbanization, these can also shape human mobility or access to resources on a continental scale. For example, shifts in transhumance patterns in the Sahel caused by a combination of changes to the climate and the environment and insecurity have a ripple effect felt hundreds of kilometers away in the Central African Republic, where the movement of herders is also being reshaped. This fuels local violence and contributes to food insecurity. Allow me a parenthesis here. It's generally agreed that climate change does not directly cause conflict. Take Australia or Japan, two countries very exposed to climate change. They're also very peaceful. One critical factor in this relationship is the strength of governance and institutions. In the absence of institutions able to mediate tensions and manage resources equitably, climate risks and environmental degradation may fuel local tensions and instability and contribute to shaping dynamics of violence. This was the case in the 3 countries that we studied. In the Central African Republic, as I just mentioned, people focused on tensions between farmers and herders resulting from changing patterns of transhumance. Iraqis flagged tensions, sometimes violent, around water sharing. In northern Mali, people also spoke of intercommunal tensions around water and land use. It's also important to bear in mind that problems faced by people may not originate from climate change. In fact, climate change tends to exacerbate existing problems. For instance, water scarcity in Iraq is not caused by climate change. It is amplified by climate change. The building of dams in neighboring countries, decaying infrastructure, a limited capacity to negotiate water sharing agreements with neighbors are all core to Iraq's water problems. Second, how do people cope and adapt? Adapting to climate change can be simple. A change in crops might do. but it often requires major changes, such as transforming a whole agricultural system. Yet, people affected by conflict are not only among those most vulnerable to the climate crisis, they are also among those most neglected by climate action because of the challenges attached to working in such environments. Ambitious, concerted, and long-term efforts to adapt are often limited in times of war. In the absence of adequate institutional support, people try to cope by changing or diversifying their livelihoods, adapting their way of life, or, ultimately, moving away from their homes. For instance, in southern Iraq, water scarcity and environmental degradation, combined with the lasting effects of conflicts that have weakened the capacity of the state to maintain infrastructure or support agriculture, have had dramatic impacts on farmers. Some turned to fishing when soils became too salty to farm. Others, with greater means, managed to change irrigation methods and crops. But livelihood options are few, and for many, the only option has been to move to cities to find daily work. Yet many have not managed to settle permanently and experience great precarity, as they lack financial and administrative support to settle in a sustainable manner. So, how should we adapt humanitarian action? Major global efforts must be made to mitigate climate change through reducing emissions. This is essential to avoid the most disastrous humanitarian consequences. But these efforts will only limit, not halt, the climate crisis. They must be complemented by measures to help people adapt. Here's our call. First, we need to refine our understanding of short and longer term risks and reinforce our capacity to develop programs addressing them. We notably need to better understand how intersecting climate risks and conflict can fuel tensions and violence at a local level. Second, as no one can address these challenges alone, we must work together across the humanitarian sector and beyond to strengthen climate action. Third, we must focus on limiting people's exposure by reducing risks and strengthening their resilience to shocks. Once people, systems, and their environment are hit and have experienced major losses, recovery is hard. And this is particularly true in situations of conflict. This calls for investing in disaster prevention and in designing programs that contribute to the resilience of livelihoods, shelters, and essential services. Here's a quick illustration. The Central African Republic is regularly hit by floods, but efforts to prevent people from settling in flood zones or to warn them of imminent floods have been inadequate. When rain poured for days in 2019, no early warning was given, so people could preventively move to safer locations. Many ended up rushing out of their collapsing homes in the middle of the night, leaving their assets behind and settling in crowded settlements at the mercy of other climate shocks and insecurity. 100,000 people were displaced, some 10,000 homes destroyed. Stronger prevention measures and a functioning early warning system could have limited losses. Now, with regards to reducing risks, we must also promote respect for the rules of international humanitarian law that protect the environment, as this can protect people's resilience. Fourth, we need to mobilize those who are best placed to mitigate climate change and facilitate climate adaptation, from state governments to local authorities to international financial institutions and the private sector. In particular, we must address gaps in access to finance for climate adaptation. For now, countries in crisis have limited access to climate finance because of their limited institutional capacity. Lastly, we must lead by example and limit the damage that we may cause to the climate and the environment through our own operations. This falls very squarely under the do no harm principle. Thank you so much.